Hello and welcome to episode number 18 of the Hafey Digital Podcast, a show for creators, makers, and doers, where my goal is to help you make to the max. And today we're going to be talking about color grading, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's get into it. Hello, everybody. Hope everybody is safe and healthy and happy out there as we continue through all this craziness that we're all dealing with. Today, we are going to be talking, as I mentioned in the introduction, about color grading. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button and follow me on social media at Ryan Hafey on Twitter and Instagram, and let's have a chat. So, no real updates for today, by the way, other than the fact that I recently went full Britney. I have shaved my head. This was kind of an agreement with my son. And I didn't shave my head; it's just a short buzz. But my son, I talked him into, because his hair was getting super long, and obviously people aren't, there's no hairstyling places open. I can cut his hair. I have cut his hair in the past and done like fades, but he kind of likes it long on the top, and I can't really fade it into long hair on the top. So he's buzzed his hair before, and I always thought it looked pretty good on him, so I convinced him to do it again, but he said only if you do it. So I did it, and he helped me with it a little bit, and hair grows back. I'm not a fan of how it looks, but it is what it is, and it'll grow back and it'll be fine. And not that I have anyone to impress at this point anyway. But other than that, not too much to report. The podcast video, there's been doesn't have a ton of views right now on my main channel. If you just search Ryan Hafey, you'll find it. My two most recent podcast studio related videos are getting a little bit of pickup relative to my channel size, and people are leaving some comments and seem to be appreciative of the information that was put in there. And by the way, drinking some strawberry bubbly today, in case anyone's wondering. But there's a third video in the works, which is related more to the software. So I've touched on all the gear and all the setup for the gear. Now we're going to talk about software. I haven't actually done any recording for that. I've been working on outlining it in my phone. But for whatever reason, I just can't find myself to. I can't get myself to get in here and actually record it. In fact, there's another video idea that I've discussed before, which is it's kind of a challenge video, making a drone, a moving day to night drone hyperlapse, which is something that I've been kicking around for a while, and I kind of have a good idea of how to do it. And I think that might be a more fun project to kind of break the monotony of this. Not that it's monotonous, but to kind of, rekindle my interest in making videos. But I might do that first, record that, and then get back into the podcast stuff. And I know I might be give myself a knock by not, getting those consecutive videos up back to back for people to see. But, I'm kind of okay with that, because I'd rather do stuff that makes me happy, I guess, because I'll get to it eventually. It's just a matter of when. But anyway, other than that, that's it. That's it for the updates. So let me bring this window over here. So what I've done is, and I'm hoping that I don't run into any issues with this, but I've adjusted my settings in Premiere so that it's allocating a little bit less memory to Premiere and more to other programs, because obviously right now I'm streaming to YouTube, I'm recording this live, and I'm also going to attempt to do some live color grading and kind of go through my process a little bit, but also just vent some of my frustrations that I have with color grading, because there's a lot of them, and hopefully we can kind of tackle those together and have an interesting, informative chat about that. But so I'm hoping that I don't run into any slow, speeds or anything. By the way, I just realized I forgot to turn on my other two angles here. There we go. So now we got camera 2 and we got camera 3. Not that they'll come in too handy today, but hey, they're here. So anyway, let's bring you over to the screen. So I've got up here, and now this is the, if you follow me on Instagram, I've been doing, took a few days off, but I've been doing these kind of 1-second clip compilation videos. Basically, I've been just kind of documenting this whole sort of quarantine that we've been experiencing. And for each clip, or almost each clip that I've been capturing, I'll pick 1 second of it in order chronologically and place them back to back. And I was updating it daily for a few days, but then I decided that I would slow down on a little bit because I wanted to actually focus and go through and pay more attention to the grades of each of these clips. And I'm realizing that that's kind of a big undertaking when you have multiple clips under various lighting conditions, day, night, indoors, outdoors. It's not as simple as just copying and pasting your edits from one to the next. So I'm going to go through and kind of talk through my process a little bit as far as how I try to achieve the best white balance and colors in camera. And then from there, what I typically do in Premiere. I have a love-hate relationship with color grading, and that is to say that I like the thought of having full ability to kind of manipulate my work however I want with some color correction, various color grades and that type of thing. But I find that I'm never fully satisfied with the final look that I get. And I just feel, I'm comparing myself to others, but you see others work and you're like, wow, how did they accomplish that? And maybe there's people that look at my stuff and think the same thing. I don't know, but I'm my own biggest critic. So I'm constantly trying to kind of work through all of that. But anyway, and by the way, if you're listening to this is going to be a highly visual podcast, but I'll do my best to try to explain what's happening and give you some information there. But so let's go through this a little bit. Oh, first I should probably explain as far as when it comes to the camera. By the way, I've been up till recently, I shoot on Sony cameras, either the Sony a6500, which I'm filming on right now, or the Sony a7 III. I typically use a Cine 2 picture profile with cinema colors, and really nothing else changed other than I turned detail down to -7 and add sharpness in post. But either Cine, but lately I've actually been shooting in HLG 3 just to kind of experiment with it. And then as far as getting white balance, I mean, typically I find that the auto white balance is usually pretty good. Like, I mean, granted, if you're moving a lot, if you're going to be going from different scenes, or if you're handheld or whatever it is, there's a chance that your white balance could fluctuate a little bit as you move. But for the stuff that I've been doing when I've been just popping the camera on a tripod, I typically find that the auto white balance is decently consistent in the results. So oftentimes I'll use auto white balance, but if I don't, I'll typically try to white balance in camera with a gray card like this. And the Sonys offer a simple way to do it. You just go to the custom white balance settings, and then it asks you to put your gray card in front in this little dot that's in the center of the screen. It'll snap a picture of it and then pick white balance based off of that. So if I have the time to do it, I'll use that. If not, I'll just kind of, put it on auto and do my thing. But anyway, so we're here in Premiere. This is a clip. I figured this would be kind of a good clip to pick. And as you can see, these are all the different clips back to back that I have. That was the one. Here we go. So right now there are no grades on this clip. This is just the straight out of camera, what I captured. And let's go through and see what we can do with this. So my general workflow when it comes to color grading, and by the way, this is a Cine 2 clip. My general workflow, I do everything in Lumetri, however you pronounce it. I typically, in fact, rarely use LUTs. I just have this weird thing about, I feel like if you just, same thing with presets. I don't buy presets because I want the look to be mine. I don't want to put someone else's look on my footage. And I know there are some LUTs out there that are specific to the different type of footage you're using. Like if you're, I think DJI for the Mavic 2 Pro, like the D-Log footage, DJI has their own proprietary LUT that you can use for that. I have used that in the past just because it, if you're shooting an 8-bit in log, your color grading, you're going to have some complications in color grading anyway because there's just not enough data there to really pull the colors and the contrast in too many different directions. All that to say that I very rarely use LUTs, and I typically like to adjust my my stuff from scratch. Now, Cine, like the Cine 2 picture profile, it's flat. It's definitely not as flat as like a log, but it's got a little bit more color saturation and a little bit more contrast. So I find that you don't have to tweak it quite as much to get to where you want with it, and that's kind of what I like. It sort of saves me time. It's a good foundation in my opinion. So this is a Cine 2 clip, and we're gonna just kind of go through and see how I would go about grading this. So the first thing that I would typically do is go into the curves, and I like to bump the mids a little bit. I've seen some tutorials where they like to bring, instead of doing that, they like to kind of go up in the highlights and bring it down here. Obviously a lot of color correction and color grading is going to be subjective. By the way, for anyone interested, the difference between color correction and color grading, color correction is basically saturation, white balance, and just basic tone adjustments to get kind of the exposure right and to get it looking like a natural scene, versus color grading, which is where you're adding more stylistic color corrections and changes and things like that. So this portion over here, this is kind of like my a little thinking habit as I'm sitting at my desk just stacking poker chips that I bought at an airport years ago. Anyway, so this portion of the process is the color correction process. So yeah, I like to bump the mids a little bit, just kind of add some overall exposure in the mids there. And then I'll typically bring the shadows down a little bit. I don't want to go too deep. The deeper you go, obviously that looks a little unnatural. So I bring them down to a point where it looks okay. And then I'll usually, and I should have them up now, but I'll typically have the lumetri scopes loaded up here. So curves is kind of where I start. I might tweak the highlights a little bit, maybe bring those down just a skosh, something like that. And I'll kind of get it into a certain ballpark. Now, as you can see in the scopes here, I am clipping on the high end and almost clipping in the blacks. So instead of correcting those here, I could technically bring this down a little bit, but I actually like to go into the basic correction panel in Lumetri Color in Premiere. By the way, again, for anyone listening, this is all in Premiere Pro. Premiere Pro and the Lumetri Color effect. So I'll go into the basic correction with my Lumetri scopes open, and I might bring the whites down a little bit. I don't want anything clipping. I don't want to lose detail in the whitest parts there. So I'll bring them down to just a little bit shy of 100%. And then in this case, because I'm dangerously close to 0 in the blacks, I will bring the blacks up ever so slightly until they're not clipping that bottom line. And then from there, I think my highlights are probably a little too harsh here. I'll bring those down. Let's see. Usually for me, it's just a matter of kind of moving the slider around to kind of get it where I want. Now this is kind of an interesting scene because you've got my monitor here, which in the center is pretty bright. You've obviously got this giant softbox that's got a light coming through it, which is super bright. And then another monitor here, but then you want to try to find a good balance between all these things and the walls. And I'm in a good position here because I'm actually in the room that I'm color grading. So if I want, I can kind of look at this wall for reference. to me right now, like that looks a little too bright. Maybe about right there. And I might play with the shadows a little bit. If you go too hot with the shadows, then you just kind of wash things out, and you have an opportunity to introduce some noise. Too dark, or bring the shadows down too far, and then you just have a lot of really unnatural contrast. You can see in the scopes here that you're not clipping anywhere, but it just looks terrible. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth with this until I get it to a place where I think it looks good and natural, and I think that's about right. Next, I might bring up the contrast a little bit, which is really just going to stretch the highlights and the shadows and give it, as it says, a little bit more contrast. The light areas are going to look lighter, the dark areas are going to look darker. So I might add a few points on the contrast scale there. Next thing I want to do once I kind of get that dialed in is play with my white balance. And in this case, I think the white balance looks okay for the most part, but in Premiere, if you're using Lumetri, there's this little white balance selector. What I will sometimes do is just kind of go around the scene and look for areas that are maybe like this gray here, which can kind of is similar in color to this gray card. I'll click on that. Now, when I did that, to me, it looks a little bit on the almost yellowish side, maybe a little bit warm, a little bit green. So I'm going to grab it again and maybe come over here and grab this little picture frame at the top. And that looks to me on the magenta side. Let's try just getting the wall here. Okay, so none of those are really getting me to exactly where I want. So what I think I'm going to do is just base off the Lumetri scopes and see if I can kind of dial in the white balance. And the way to do that is, now I have, by the way, I have the waveform RGB, parade RGB, and vector scope YUV. So this is the waveform, this is the parade. This just basically separates the three different color channels versus the waveform, which kind of combines them all into one. And then vector scope YUV, we'll get to that in a minute. Actually, I lied. I'm going to back up a little bit because one of the things I want to do before I get to white balance is play with my saturation a little bit. So if you're using the vector scope, which I have here, you'll see, you have all the colors, red, green, cyan, blue, magenta, yellow, and the mess that's inside of that indicates where all your colors are and how saturated they are. If you bring the saturation down, you see everything kind of shrink in towards the center, and now you have a black and white image. If you bring it way up, everything just kind of blows out, and then you've got this super saturated, unnatural looking image. So you want to find a good balance, but also, especially for TV purposes, you ever want to, I don't know necessarily, I tend to stay within this range, meaning that if you go beyond the line that connects all those different colors in the vector scope, you're oversaturating. So if you've ever made any work for TV, they may come back and say, I'm sorry, we can't use this, it's too saturated, because you have to stay within certain limits as far as saturation goes. So I try to stick to that and keep all my saturation within those boundaries. So in this case, I might come up a little bit. Let's see. I find that in Cine 2, for my personal preference, you get up to about 110 on the saturation slider, and that's about as far as you want to go. So I might do that. I also will sometimes go into the creative tab here and bump vibrance up. And vibrance, by the way, the difference between vibrance and saturation, as far as I understand it, vibrance is going to, let's say if you have really saturated reds, but your blues aren't very saturated. If you crank up the vibrance, it's going to sort of even out the saturation of those colors. So your blue will become more saturated and your red not so much. Versus changing the actual saturation, every color is just going to be intensified and more saturated evenly across the board versus evening it out. So what I like to do is bring up the vibrance a little bit. Now, the vibrance slider, I always find, introduces some really weird stuff if you push it too hard, as you can see here. Looks like there's some coronavirus on the the wall in the back there. I don't know what all that is, but you can see all these nasty artifacts that it incorporated in there. So we are going to undo that, but I do like to push the vibrance up a little bit and then bring the saturation down just a few points. And I actually do this a lot when I'm editing photography as well. So let's take a look. Before, after. So you can see it's a little bit more saturated, a little more contrasty. It looks a little bit more natural, in my opinion. In fact, I might even come back here and bring these highlights down just a little bit more. Okay, good. Now that we've got that, let's see. Now let's try and tweak this white balance a little bit. Actually, I'm not upset with how the white balance looks right now. But what I will do is let's look at these vector scopes. I like to look at the parade. If you look across, actually, let's look at the waveform first. You can kind of see that there are certain points throughout the image. And by the way, if you were to overlay, let's say, the waveform on top of your video here, you would see that this corresponds with different parts of your clip. So for example, these, super bright parts of the image here, that's obviously going to be coming from the big softbox there. So you can kind of pinpoint where things are in the scene. But what I'm noticing looking at this waveform is that kind of in the mid-tones, just touching into the shadows, it looks a little on the warm side and you can tell that because the reds are a little bit raised up over the blues. So I can try to go in here and cool it down a little bit. And now when I do that, you can obviously see that cooled down the image. So that section may not be what you want to shoot for. Let's look at the parade RGB here, and let's see if we can maybe even out these three little peaks here, and let's see what that does. So if we bring the the temperature back up a little bit, and looks like the green is right in line, so we don't need to adjust that. That looks pretty good. If we look down here into the kind of the upper echelon of the shadows, you can see that the reds are a little elevated, and the greens and blues are kind of on the same plane. So there's a way you can adjust that also in the curves. This is where it gets a little bit more advanced, and I'm definitely not an expert at this. But if you go into the curves panel here, did I already have? Oh yeah, that's the adjustments I made earlier. So in the curves panel here, obviously we made some curve adjustments earlier, but that was curve adjustments for all channels, red, green, and blue combined. We on the white channel there. That's my dog Boba barking, if you can hear him. But you can also adjust the individual color channels. So let's click on the red, and just to kind of give you an example of how this works. Let's bring up the reds in the shadows. There you go. If we take out reds in the shadows, then we get the opposite of red, which is green. Excuse me. So what we want to try to do here is bring down the reds a little bit in the kind of, this would correspond to right about here on the curve. So if we bring the reds down, you can see that in the parade, and I'm not even looking at the image as I'm doing this. What I'm trying to do is get sort of this area of the vector scope evened out. And it seems like I've done that, but in the process of doing that, you can see that up here, the reds are now a little bit lower. So to fix that, we can just come up here and bump the reds up a little bit there until it's in line with the greens and the blues. Okay. And then if you look up at the waveform there, you can kind of see that. What you want, for the most part, is to see kind of white. You want to see the red, green, and the blue overlapping, and that's going to indicate or give you a better indication that your white balance is more correct. And I am actually okay with this. So if we turn off the curves off and on, you can kind of see the difference there. Trying to think, because now as I turn them off and on, see, and this is where you backtrack, because you're like, okay, that looks good, and then you look at the before and after, you're like, oh wait, now it looks a little green. To me, it looks a little bit on the green side. So let's go up to basic correction and see what happens if we tweak the... see, I don't want to do that. Okay. All right. I think that's about good. I think that's about realistic. So I think that we have what we need. I'm actually going to bring the whites down a little bit more because somehow or another the blues crept up and are clipping a little bit. So bring that down. Good. Okay. Now, I think we have a color corrected image at this point. I think this is where we want to be. And there are other things that you can do as you go through some of these as far as color correction goes. But for this, I mean, just as far as getting the image looking the way we want, I think this is good. So next up is where we start doing our color grading and adding some stylistic flair to it. So what you can do here is you can do this one of two ways. You can either add another Lumetri color effect so that you kind of have your color correction and your color grade separated, which, you know, if you need to make adjustments to one or the other, you can do it easily without kind of getting things confused. But in my case, I like to add an adjustment layer. So I'll bring an adjustment layer on top, and I'll have the Lumetri color panel still open, and I can just, as long as I've got that adjustment layer selected, I can go into the Lumetri color panel, make my adjustments, and those will be adjusted, and those adjustments will be made on the adjustment layer and then applied to any clips beneath it. So as far as color grading goes, here's what I like to do. First things first, what do I like to do? I like to come down here in the HSL secondary. And we've all seen that kind of orange and teal look. It's a very cinematic look. And the science behind that has to do with color theory. So, you know, for example, the opposite of blue is going to be yellow, or the opposite of orange is going to be kind of that teal color. And that's going to, so basically, if you have orange on top of blue or on top of teal, that orange is going to pop a little bit more because those colors have so much contrast. They're opposite colors. So that's why a lot of people go for that type of grade. You're obviously not limited to that. I think orange and teal works best because orange is most similar to like natural skin tones. But I'm going to try to accomplish that using the HSL secondary. I've seen a lot of different tutorials about how to accomplish the orange and teal look in Premiere. And a lot of them have give you suggestions using the color wheels. And I've never found that to work out very well. It just doesn't work all that well for me. So what I'm going to do, and actually before I do that, we're going to go into the curves here because there's so many steps in this that I forget the order in which they go oftentimes. But what I want to do first is I want to make sure that my skin tones look okay. And to do that, I mean, from a distance, and there's not a whole lot of skin tone going on in this clip here, but I still want to make sure, because if I'm going to be adjusting, or if I'm going to be using this grade on subsequent clips, I want to make sure that, you'll see why here in a second, but I want to make sure that my skin tones are going to look good. So what I'll do is I'll grab the, I don't want to do that in the adjustment layer. Let me delete that. Okay. We're going to click on the clip itself. We're going to grab the pen tool under opacity, and let's just grab this portion on my neck here. Okay, that's obviously very small, so we're going to bump that up. Let's see, where did it go? Oh, great, I can't see it now. Oh, wait, there it is. Boom, okay. So if you have the skin tone selected and you go back to your Lumetri scopes, if you look at your YUV, is that what it is? Yeah, vector scope YUV. What you want to aim for is that this line, the colors of the skin kind of ride this line between red and yellow. And in this case, it does exactly that. So I'm not going to make any adjustments there. But if I were going to, what I would typically do is either next to the hue versus hue, grab this little dropper and click on the skin tone, and it'll automatically kind of select that range here. And then I'll just adjust it, and you can see now it's kind of more on the purple side. Now it's more on the green side, but we don't need to do any of that. So I'm going to double click and undo that. I'm going to go back in my effects control panel. I'm going to delete that mask, and I'm going to reset my position settings. Okay, so that's a good thing. You don't need to adjust any skin tones. So now we're going to go down into the HSL secondary, and what we're going to do basically is select our skin tones and create a mask that will allow us to incorporate that teal color into the scene without it affecting skin tones. So what you want to do is grab this little dropper here and select the skin tone. And then you can grab the little dropper with the plus on it and get different variations of it, different luminances of it. And then next to this color gray thing here, select that, and it's going to show you, based on what you selected with the dropper, what you have selected here. And then you can kind of adjust these sliders a little bit. So you can either click on these little triangles up top, or you can kind of fine tune and adjust the ones on the bottom. This color range typically works well for skin tones. I'm going to move the saturation slider, maybe expand that a little bit. See, about right there. What you want to do is isolate the skin tones and try not to isolate anything that's not skin. Let's check the luminance. Let's see. See, if I move over here, I'm starting to get stuff up on the walls and lose the skin tone. So I'm going to keep going until I get where I want. I might extend this. Let's see, I don't want to do that. This can take a little bit of time here. Okay, that's not bad. Let's see, maybe bring that back. Yeah, this part. Okay. Sorry, I know this is great pod for all you audio listeners out there. But I'm gonna go ahead and stick with right about here. I know we're picking some things up in the background, but that's not a huge deal. Next thing I want to do is turn up the denoise and the blur about, I don't know, maybe 1/6 of the way up the slider. Then I'm going to click this little box next to the color gray section there, and that's going to invert it. So now you can kind of see what's selected there. And I'm going to uncheck that so you don't see what's being masked. Now, if you go down to this color wheel here, pull this down in the direction of teal, you can see, if I turn this off and on, that's off, that's on, off, on. You can see that some of the teal color has been infused into the clip there. I might bring this a little bit more. I find that if you go a little too intense, doesn't exactly look natural. So I bring it down just a tiny bit because I don't want it to be too intense. I just want it to be nice and subtle, and I want those skin tones to pop. So I like that. You can adjust this a little bit if you want to kind of play with the exposure. I might even bring it down a little bit. Maybe that's up. I can't even tell. Right there. And I think that looks pretty good to me. Now, another thing you want to do here, and the best way to illustrate how this works, because it's not always easy to see with your eye, but if you, and of course, Lumetri scopes don't want to load for me right now. Gotta love Premiere. There they go. Okay, so what else you can do here is you can come down to the Luma versus saturation curves. And if you, basically what these will do is these will allow you to desaturate certain parts of the certain parts of the clip. So what we're going to do with these curves is we're going to desaturate the whitest whites and the darkest darks. And the reason we're going to do that is because when you use the HSL slider, it's, besides for what you masked, it's just going to throw color into everything. So, for example, that softbox is white. It's not going to be blue. It's not going to be red. That's white light. That's what you want it to appear as. And same thing with the darkest shadows. Those shadows are going to be black. They're not going to be blue tinted. They're going to be black. So what you can do, this is kind of a pro tip that I've learned along the way from a couple of different people. Click about right there at that first solid line. Oops, I adjusted everything. There we go. Click there. And then bring it down till just to the edge. And then do the same on the other side. Ugh. Keeps messing up on me. There we go. Boom. Boom. Now, when you're looking at your clip, you may not notice anything, and that's normal. But if you turn it off, and if you look over at your lumetri scopes and your YUV, off, on, off, on, you can see how it adjusts. And you may not see it in your clip, but you can see it in the lumetri scopes. And what you've got now is just a more accurate image as far as shadows and highlights are concerned. So we'll turn that back on. And at this point, let's take a look at the before and after. And we'll turn off effects. That was before. Looked almost a little red to me. And after. And now that I'm looking at the before and after, it looks really intense on the blue side. So I'm going to go back down to the HSL secondary. And I got to make sure, yep, I do. I have the adjustment layer selected. And I'm going to... yeah, that's overall saturation. I'm just going to bring this back a little bit so it's not quite as intense. Let's turn the HSL secondary off and back on. And I think I'm okay with that level of blue. Another thing you can do if you go into curves, and let's say you want the skin tones to pop a little bit more, you can kind of select that skin tone range and bump up the saturation for those colors. Now keep in mind, if you do this, this is going to bump the saturation for all reds and oranges in your scene. So just make sure that you're okay with that. And actually, no, I don't want to do that. And so if you turn it off and back on, might not be easy to see over YouTube, but there's a very subtle difference in the color of the skin. But it just makes the skin pop a little bit more. Let's see what else. Vignette. I'll add vignettes every now and then. You typically will bring it down and then bring the feather way up so it's super subtle. Off, on, off, on. In this case, I don't think I need it. Color wheels. Where I find color wheels come in handy is, let's say, you get your... I've had instances where the white balance looks great, or at least for the most part, the scene looks good, but maybe I have a little bit too much yellow in my highlights. Or maybe in this case, I want to counteract kind of that blue that was added to the highlights, and make it not so intense, but maybe just in the highlights. You can kind of do that with the color wheels. So let's say I want the highlights to be a little bit less teal. Well, to counteract one color, you just add the opposite color. So in highlights, we're going to go and add kind of like some orangish red. Just to kind of give you an idea. I'll push it hard in the opposite direction there, and you can see what it does. But if we bring it back down, let's see, we'll turn that off and on, off and on. And I actually kind of like that. So again, this may be difficult to see. This is why color grading is so difficult, because there's such subtle nuances, especially if you're doing it yourself. Someone might look at this and be like, wow, it looks good. But I'm sitting here looking at it like, nah, there's too much blue in the highlights. Again, my own biggest critic. But so, all right, color wheels, off and on, off and on. I feel like adding a little bit of that sort of orangish red makes it look a little bit more natural in the highlights. And as you can see over here in the waveform, you've still got your widest whites. For example, here, that's pure white. And you can tell that because of, the red, green, and blue all matches up. And that was accomplished because of what we did with the curves in the Luma versus saturation curves section. And that's kind of my workflow. And I know that sounds like a lot. Granted, as I'm doing it in real time, I'm going a lot quicker than that. But now in theory, and this is where Premiere and just color grading in general gets really frustrating. Less Premiere, more just color grading. Here's another clip that was filmed using the same exact camera angle, the same exact exposure, same exact white balance settings, everything. In theory, and actually this has some adjustments on it, so I'm going to go ahead and delete those. Boom. Make sure there's nothing in master. There is. Boom. Okay. Now, in theory, I should be able to go back here, grab the lumetri color effect from this first clip that we just graded, and copy that, Control-C, click on the new one, Control-V. Okay, good. And then I should be able to drag this adjustment layer over. And all right, in this case, looks pretty good. But and obviously that's going to be because the camera, again, is in the same position. Lighting hasn't changed at all, and none of the settings have changed. But if you tried to, here's a different angle. Let's try this. So I should already have that copied. Let's remove any effects I've got in there already. Boom. Okay, good. If we paste in those effects, all right. And if we bring the adjustment layer over here, see, now we got to go back because I feel like, hang on. Those effects did not copy over. Here we go. Okay. So now if I'm looking at this, that looks good to me. But now if I'm looking at this clip, which again, same lighting conditions, I'm assuming I shot them using the same camera settings and everything. To me, this looks oversaturated. It looks, and if we can confirm that in the lumetri scopes, looks like we're getting real close to being oversaturated in the reds, I mean that's an easy fix. Bring that down, but this is why color correction can get so confusing because just how many steps. My skin looks way overexposed there, so I might even just bring the whole. No, I don't like that. See, and that's another thing too. Like, you're like, oh, it looks overexposed. Let's bring the exposure down. But now my skin looks like milky and sort of washed out. So reset that. Try to bring the highlights down, which kind of works. But then again, the other interesting thing is if you go back to one of these other clips, well, let me see. If you want to try to match, you can, I might be able to try to bring kind of the brightest section here. Let's see, this section goes up to about 75. Let's try to adjust the whites a little bit so that it's about 75. Okay, good. And then you got to bring the highlights down. And that to me just doesn't look the same. Like my skin tones look darker there. So this is my frustration with Premiere and color grading. It's just the inconsistency of it. And I know Premiere has its features like in the color wheels and match section. I could technically, let's try it. Well, what this allows you to do is compare the clip that you're currently on with another clip, and it'll analyze the two and kind of adjust the color wheels to hopefully match up the colors. So if we go into comparison view, and let's see if we can find, there, okay. So what we want to do is we want to match the clip on the right with the clip on the left. Let's let Premiere do its thing, apply match. And by the way, this tool is, it works maybe 50% of the time, meaning it'll analyze it and adjust it 50% of the time. Sometimes I'll click on it and it won't do anything. But anyway, okay, so it has applied its matches, and to me it looks, well, let's see, let's turn off comparison view. Yeah, no, I don't like it. Also, I can tell here, if you're looking here, let's turn off HSL secondary on this clip. We'll have to turn it off in the adjustment layer. Oh, maybe not. That's interesting. I had thought that the HSL secondary just wasn't working in this section of my beard. If we turn off effects, man, maybe I just have a lot of gray in my beard and it wasn't being picked up. Yeah. But that's the joy and the pain of color grading. But that's my process. Color correction, which is just adjusting, your basic tone adjustments, getting correct exposure, correct contrast, correct white balance, correct saturation, kind of getting the image to looking like natural. And then you have your color grades, which is where you add your stylistic flair to it and kind of your own color style. I typically like the high contrast look is kind of evidenced by the scene here that I have in the studio. But that's just kind of my style. Some people enjoy the faded film look. If we go back in here and if you go to creative, you can also accomplish this with curves. You can either go to the creative panel and turn up faded film, which will kind of give you that sort of faded out look a little bit, or it actually kind of looks cool on that clip, that versus that. I kind of like that. Or you can go into the curves and go to the whites here. And if you bring up your, the blacks at the bottom, you can typically sort of accomplish the same type of effect. You can see where it's called crushing the blacks, where, they almost kind of wash out a little bit, but it gives a little bit of an old timey feel. Just depends on how you prefer to do it and which looks best to your taste. But anyway, yeah, so that's why that's why I haven't been adding too many new 1 second clip compilations. The color grading, it takes a long time. I wish there was a magic fix where you could just copy one grade onto an entire set of clips and be done with it. It just doesn't work that way. So if anybody has any tips or tricks, I would love to hear about them. And yeah. So anyway, well, I hope to help somebody out there. But I think how long? Oh shit, we've been doing this for over 45 minutes now. So I think that's it for today, and I hope you got something out of it. Thank you so much for watching once again. If you are new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and be sure to follow me on social media on Twitter and Instagram at Ryan Hafey. Come over, have a chat. I don't bite. Let's have a conversation. Ask me some questions. I don't have a whole lot better to do at the moment, so feel free to fire away and let me know if you have any questions or anything like that. And with that, I will go ahead and end this one, and we will see you next week. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.